Hello, everyone who's on the call. We welcome you. What happens when your tapping client goes there? I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about myself. So, my name is Suzanne Fageol. My credentials for coming into this work are that I have a degree in religion and psychological studies. I am a counselor, licensed counselor with the state of Washington. And I came into this particular trauma work through my own personal work, which is that in 1995, sorry, it's been a long time, I was in a very bad hurricane in the Caribbean where I lost my entire house, which blew away from around me, and I almost lost my life. And so I obviously had incurred quite a lot of trauma. And in my quest to work with this trauma, I ended up falling into a relatively new form of trauma treatment at the time, which was called somatic trauma release work. And you may know the name of Peter Levine or Bessel van der Kolk or Dan Siegel, all of who practice this form of trauma release work. And I had the good fortune to work locally with a woman named Sharon Stanley who had studied with Peter Levine. And I ended up taking her 2-year professional mental health counseling trauma training in this work. And in addition, I studied another 5 years with her. So I've been learning this material for about 10 years. I'm also an EFT and matrix practitioner, and so I come at this from wearing a lot of different hats. Now, there are certain things that all practitioners can do to help with trauma, and one of the reasons that I came into partnership with Craig to do this work is because I feel that it's really important that everybody be informed to a certain level about how to work with trauma. There isn't one place on the planet that doesn't have traumatized people through either natural disasters or by becoming refugees or war or just living in an unfortunate neighborhood or just life circumstances. And understanding what you can do is essential as knowing the basics of tapping and should be a part of every single one of your toolkits. Whether you work as an EFT practitioner, which those on the call do, or anyone else, it is a really important skill package to have, but especially if you're working with tapping and people are bringing you issues in their life that aren't right, chances are you're going to run into trauma. And knowing what your skill level is and knowing what you should not be doing is just as important as knowing what you can do. Hence the title of our program tonight, What Happens When Your Tapping Client Goes There. Now, tapping is a somatic trauma release technique, and that's partly why we're teaching this course, because it's a very good fit for this new enterprise of somatic trauma release work. And it has a broader scope, and as you'll hear in the call, we're going to be covering that broader scope as well. But the idea is for you to have the knowledge of trauma such that you can help your people even more effectively as you work with them and trauma comes up. So enough about me for the moment. I'm going to hand this over to Craig and let him introduce himself.
Great. Hi, everybody that's on the call and those from around the world that are listening to the recording at different time zones. A little bit about myself, just to put it in perspective, and then we'll get to some really important things that we're going to be teaching about that are part of the 8-week Tapping Out of Trauma webinar course. So my credentials a bit, I've been in private practice in California and Washington for 29 years, working in the healthcare field, and working with people who've experienced trauma. As a chiropractor, as a body worker, in the fields of energy medicine, as an EFT practitioner and trainer. I have a degree in pre-med biology from Lafayette College. I received my Doctor of Chiropractic degree magna cum laude from Life Chiropractic College West. And currently I maintain a private practice in the Seattle, Washington area where I treat patients, I lecture, I train practitioners with my wife, Alina Frank, in EFT and matrix reimprinting, and I'm a trauma educator. I provide and teach continuing education courses for multiple organizations. What I want to share on a personal level is we're going to be talking about stress and trauma, and mostly trauma tonight, and although both are equally important. I have a personal relationship that also drew me into this work, though I didn't know it for a long time. As a young boy, I knew what it was like to be scared all the time. And I really didn't know what it was like to feel really safe. So until I was about 13, I was the smallest, shortest boy in my class, and it wasn't uncommon that I was bullied by bigger boys. As growing up Jewish, I also was teased incessantly about my family and religion, even though it was a progressive neighborhood. As the oldest child of four to a father who was not only a father but was also simultaneously my private, personal, one-on-one tennis coach, he at that point was prone to pretty frequent outbursts, anger and rage, and I learned very intimately and personally what hypervigilance meant. Always watching out, always watching and wondering when the next something was going to fall around me. So I was always aware. And that early anxiety that I felt when I was young led to a condition where I scratched my body and created scabs on my body all the time because of that fear, anxiousness, and what I now know is early emotional trauma, but didn't really know that back then. Though I never really doubted being loved by my dad, and we have a very close relationship.
I don't know what's happening.
Okay.
Okay.
What I was saying is that I really intimately understood the emotional, physical, and psychological aspects of childhood trauma. And over decades, in the use of a lot of techniques, but especially EFT tapping, I've come to heal from what burdened me, what limited my life, and showed up as repetitive dysfunctional patterns and relationships that really affected my personal life and my work. So when I look to those things that led me to working in the field of people that have anxiousness and fear and trauma, I now am grateful for that which I lived through and learned much from and gained much wisdom from, but it was not something that felt good while I was going through it. So what I want to start off with in tonight's teleclass is that we all know, so all of us are either tapping practitioners on the call or we have some familiarity with tapping, I assume, and that's why you're on the call, that we're to know, truly know, that we are not supposed to go where we're not supposed to go. We're supposed to know our boundaries. We're supposed to know our scopes of practice, whether you're a coach, chiropractor, mental health counselor, whatever you are. As a coach, we have to know, for example, that we're not a licensed mental health care provider. And we should know that there are things and conditions that we do not work with. We do not work directly with a client who's bipolar or one who's schizophrenic or actively suicidal. These should be really clear, and if they're not, they need to be. Those kinds of conditions can be worked out. We'll talk more about collaboration, but certainly not on one's own. But if you've been out there and you've been tapping with other people long enough, it's for sure that you will have worked or will work with somebody on an issue that seemed like no big thing. Maybe it was a public speaking anxiety or some back pain. Or in fact, a story I recall is one time we were doing a group and Alina and I worked with a woman who just had a shoulder problem. We thought that would be easy to work with in a group, and ended up getting way beyond that, and all of a sudden went from shoulder pain into a very serious early childhood trauma. It is very possible that at some point you'll be working with somebody with what seems like a small issue when suddenly your client starts shaking, sweating, turning pale, looking around the room, eyes wide open, and they start moving toward a full-blown abreaction. Well, for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, an abreaction is what we call the intense expression and release of previously repressed emotion, as if reliving the experience currently. So it absolutely can happen, even if you're not looking for trauma, even if you're not asking about trauma, that suddenly one of your clients can all of a sudden be right in the middle of a trauma, and we have to be prepared for that as practitioners. Suzanne?
Yes, sorry, trying to take care of some people having trouble getting on. This is only an audio call, folks. There is no visual, so that's number one. And if you can hear me and you're having trouble and it's not working, the only thing I can suggest is you call free conference call and ask them what the problem is. I'm sorry, I can't do anything else about it.
Or they'll be able to just get the recording afterwards, too.
Yes, you will be able to get the recording. Okay, so despite your intention to keep your sessions feeling safe,
needs your attention.
Despite your intention to keep the sessions feeling safe, you might now find yourself where a session has gotten out of control, and you might find yourself in over your head with a client sobbing hysterically or something. And you might not feel confident in your ability to get them back into a neutral place. Or maybe you're triggered by their reaction. The question arises, should you continue to work with this client? Do you have the skill set to re-regulate their nervous system? Or should you be referring them out, and do you know how to do a referral? So I'd like to sort of put this in a context by actually telling you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about Sally. Sally is an EFT practitioner who used to be an accountant. She loved EFT when she first did it and received her certification, and so she opened her practice about 6 months ago. So she's definitely in the league of many people listening to this call and who are EFT practitioners, and that they're not mental health providers, but they're EFT coaches. So Sally was a student that I had mentored, and she told me this story about a client session and asked for my feedback about it. And I felt like this was a particularly relevant story to share with you. She told me of a client, I'm going to call her Anne, who wanted to work on feeling more fulfilled at work. Seems like a pretty straightforward issue. Anne's biggest problem was that she received no encouragement from her boss, and even though he never criticized her, he also never praised her. She tried taking more initiative, but without any feedback from him, she just stopped trying. So in their third session, Sally and Anne were tapping on Anne's boss not noticing her work, when Anne suddenly started breathing fast and shaking and crying, and seemed to be looking at something or someone that only she could see in front of her. Anne looked at Sally as if she was a million miles away. She really wasn't in the room energetically. Sally told her in a calm, soothing voice that she wasn't alone, that she, Sally, was here with Anne, and suggested that they both start tapping together. Just tapping, no words. Sally reassured her in a calm, soothing way, continuing to tap. She asked Anne to just look at her, to notice that she was not alone, that she was in fact safe right here in the room together with Sally. In her calm voice, she asked Anne to notice and focus on the physical act of tapping on herself. She asked Anne to move her focus to Sally's presence with her in the room. And she continued talking so that the client would know that she was not alone, and again asked her to notice that they were tapping together. After a few minutes, Anne calmed down, and they just kept tapping until Sally noticed that the client really was back and present in the room. And Sally said it took quite a while. It took some minutes. Sally asked Anne how she was at that moment, and Anne reported feeling a lot calmer and was able to look into Sally's eyes. And Anne wanted to tell Sally what she had experienced. But Sally just encouraged her to just stay within herself and to keep tapping, just tapping, until her SUD was at a 0. When that happened, Sally told the client that since she had had such a big reaction, that she didn't feel it was a good idea to get into the story again now, even though she knew that Anne desperately wanted to rush in and tell her everything. Instead, Sally did a sneaking away tapping sequence in which they tapped that Anne could come back to this issue later, but that right here, right now, she was okay. Sally made sure she was okay, and she also had her book another session so that they could slowly begin to explore the issue at a pace that would allow them to slowly get to all the different aspects in a way that would not be so intense. And you'll notice, too, that Sally never asked Anne what it was going on with her, what the story was. Meanwhile, she also told Anne that if she felt the intensity coming back, she could just tap on herself until her SUD went down again. Sally then followed up with Anne by calling her the next day to see how she was doing. In reviewing the account of her session, I told Sally that she'd done an excellent job in handling the situation, and then we discussed what she might do moving forward. So, what does this story teach us about working with trauma? Well, first, you never know when you're going to be taken down the rabbit hole. And good interpersonal skills are an important foundation of neural regulation. And neural regulation is the foundation for working with trauma. This story also shows Sally using many of the skills that we teach in tapping out of trauma to bring about neural regulation, like tone of voice, tapping without words, establishing rapport, and maintaining that connection amidst heightened emotion. Sally's story also demonstrates that many of the physical emotional signs that are indicative of what happens when someone is in a trauma capsule were displayed by Anne. And while many methods that help to neurally regulate a client may be simple and obvious, what's important is to understand their underlying mechanisms so that they can enhance our skills and effectiveness as a practitioner and reduce the likelihood of re-traumatization of a client who may go into some kind of an abreaction.
Thanks, Suzanne. So, to me, I hear a story like that, and what I learn and take away from that is that by being grounded and being present, there are many intuitive skills that we bring to a session. But when we start to really understand the whys and the how to do them better and learn them more, we can really implement those features of a safe container and be able to prevent somebody going into abreaction by intentionally creating that space by learning the underlying neurobiological tools. Now, that's not pointed to any one profession or person or coach or anything, because learning these skills is really important for everybody that's working with clients that have had trauma. So, as an EFT practitioner, many of us have become accustomed to what I would say achieving some pretty amazing results. You know, I don't think that there's an EFT or tapping practitioner that I talk to that can't tell me some miraculous and amazing stories of healing. Sometimes the results happen with such speed and efficiency that it even startles us, even me. And while this is wonderful, it's also important to know that working with clients who've undergone serious trauma requires a very different pace and approach than somebody who doesn't or who has not experienced that. The danger of re-traumatization of a client who's lived through big T traumas is very real and much more common than we care to know. And as a skilled practitioner, whether you're a licensed or unlicensed mental health care provider, we need to be diligent, skillful, and careful with the questions that we ask in a session. And I'm going to use a short story of an experience that I went through in a training that is going to help demonstrate that. So about a year ago, Alina and I were teaching, and we had an EFT student, I'm going to call him Philip. Now, Philip was a licensed mental health care professional. He'd been in practice, 5-10 years. And he'd had previous EFT training. He was with us to deepen his knowledge, and he had been working over the past year to integrate the tapping work into his practice. Okay, so during the training with us, there were times, of course, we break into a lot of dyads and we're practicing different techniques. And I noticed that he kept getting quite frustrated, and in fact, even a little bit perturbed and upset. So when I went up to ask him what was wrong on a break, he asked me that he'd been noticing that quite a few of his partners during the training would get really easily triggered. And he was wondering why he kept getting the people that were getting easily triggered and were getting pretty intense emotionally pretty quickly during the dyad exercises. And then he shared that he actually noticed that this really wasn't uncommon as well back home with his regular clients. And then, sheepishly and embarrassingly, he admitted that some of those people that got intense very quickly never returned after their first session. What he started to realize as we spoke more during the training was that it was he had thought previously that the challenge of what was going on was his clients, when they didn't come back, was that they weren't ready to do their personal work, that they were avoiding the pain or discomfort of dealing with the real issues and looking at their emotional baggage and their past. But after he listened to our module that we were teaching on trauma capsules, he really came to realize that he'd been more responsible for the scenario and the results than he originally thought. What he realized that he was doing is that he'd been jumping right into the middle of trauma capsules very quickly with new clients, and by jumping directly into a trauma capsule during fairly intense emotional releases, you could absolutely re-traumatize a person and cause real harm. Now, why was this happening to him? What he found out and realized was that the way he'd been originally taught to ask, and I hear this out there way too often, even with a brand new client, to quote-unquote get to the heart of the matter, was to ask, when was the first time that you ever felt this way? Now, by asking that before a lot of work developed, by asking that before working on more current scenarios and for a variety of other reasons, he thought he was following proper EFT protocol. He continued to always ask his clients this question early in their beginning relationship, and sometimes it didn't cause any problems, but other times it caused very strong emotional reactions very, very quickly. His error was that he didn't know how to read all the physical and emotional and neurobiological signs that indicated that this person was in a traumatized state, and this showed up with the client showing signs of either dissociation or hyperarousal. And as a result of that work and more, he became more trauma-informed, especially with regard to integrating the tapping techniques into his practice. So he left the training much more confident. Now that he knew a lot more about trauma capsules, he updated his tapping skills, his trauma knowledge, and he understood that you should never begin too quickly with a client and jump right into the middle of a trauma capsule. And a question like that, when was the first time, can do that very, very quickly and commonly. Now, I talked to him since that time, and he told me that he's much better now at noticing all the trauma cues, and not once has he jumped into the middle of a trauma capsule. So what's important to note about that story? Well, much of the newer trauma information that's been coming out over the last several years is coming out newly, not just to tapping coaches, but also to counselors and therapists and social workers and all kinds of healthcare practitioners. Second point I want to make is that as much as we desire to help our clients heal their past, we have to be wary of working at a pace that does not outpace what a client's neurobiology can process. Just because we're used to moving fast and getting to the heart of the matter does not mean that the client is ready to do that. And lastly, there's really no way that a sufficient depth of information regarding trauma can be taught in a basic EFT certification program. I know, I'm a trainer, I know that. And that a lack of knowledge in this arena can make you not only a less effective practitioner, but can actually re-traumatize a client. So those are the takeaway points for me.
Thanks, Craig. So there's one other point that we would like to bring up on this call about what happens when your tapping client goes there, and that is the harm to you as a practitioner. Now, some of you may be going, what do you mean? Well, secondary trauma, or vicarious trauma as it is sometimes called, is another issue that can happen when you have a client who has trauma. It's not spoken about much in tapping circles, but it can happen that when the trauma that your client presents with is the same trauma that may have affected your own life. It might be that in some way their reaction to the trauma resembles a reaction of our own, or a response or emotion that we may have held as a result of something traumatic in our own past. And we may not even recognize it as such or immediately in the moment. We may know something doesn't feel right, but we may assume that it has to do with the client and that it's not necessarily that it's also affecting us as well. This is why it's called secondary trauma, and why it is so critical that every practitioner be working on their own personal issues at all times to clear whatever you can out of your own life, and that also we know how to neurally regulate ourselves when we're exposed in a session to a potential trigger for our own traumatic history. And sometimes we don't discover that until we actually get in the situation. But it really behooves us to look at our own stuff when we get out of the session. And if we find ourselves feeling really off, we might want to check in and say, does this have something to do with me as well? And often these signs are not so easily recognized. For instance, it may feel like real fatigue, or even an avoidance of a particular client. It may come across as, I really don't like that client very much. Or a loss of energy in your practice as a whole, or it could be intrusive thoughts, or just symptoms of depression in general. And you're kind of wondering, what is happening? So it can be quite insidious, and you might not recognize it right away. So we spend some time in the class looking at that as well. Now, what do you do when you have this person, and for whatever reasons, as we talked about above, either they're too triggered or our own stuff is triggered, what do we do? What is it about? What is a referral? When do you decide to refer and when not to refer? That's really the question. And so when a client presents you with symptoms that look like PTSD or complex trauma, which has a whole host of symptoms and a very particular diagnosis in the psychological world, and since we're not diagnosing, we can't go there, but we can certainly recognize the signs, then you will most likely want to refer them to a licensed mental health care provider if this client is not already in relationship with one. And a caveat here is you want to try and find or help them, refer them to some practitioner who has experience with trauma. Because this this level of trauma requires very long and careful repair, including the healing of original infant attachment issues and perhaps other repetitive childhood trauma that really is beyond the scope of most EFT coaches. So it may be possible to do an EFT in collaboration with a licensed mental health counselor, and where you would be in a secondary role and they are under supervision by a mental health care provider, but you might be working with them so that you can help to lessen the symptoms and work on the symptomatology as it is in current time, while the therapist is working on some of the deeper repair issues from infancy and childhood. As we stated previously, if a client goes into an aberaction, it's our job to help them re-regulate themselves because they're not able to do so. Their left brain or cognitive function is offline when they're in that position. And so Sally managed to get the client she had in the story I told, Anne, back into the room, but she didn't pursue the tapping at that point. So once that is accomplished, the re-regulation of the client and the calming down of their nervous system, then a decision-making process needs to occur by which you determine if the client is best served by working with you or by being referred out. And it's very clear that if a client continues to show signs of an inability to self-regulate, if every single time they keep getting intensely triggered, then referral out is very definitely the best course of action, unless, of course, you happen to be a trauma specialist as well as an EFT coach. So in tapping out of the trauma webinar, we will certainly be going into greater depth of not only how to recognize when, but how to refer in such a way that it is supportive and promotes the well-being of both the client and the EFT practitioner.
Great. Thanks.
So,
Yeah.
Sorry, Craig, did you want to say something?
No, I was going to go ahead and put some of those pieces together here.
Okay.
Yeah. So what Suzanne just went over, she went over vicarious trauma, she went over referral. These are all really important concepts and ones that we're going to be going over in much more depth in the Tapping Out of Trauma webinar class. Tonight you've heard about trauma capsules. You've heard a little bit about neuroregulation, avoiding abreactions, vicarious or secondary trauma, knowing when to refer. And if you're going to be working in the world of EFT, and you're going to be working in the world of trauma, it is an absolute must to have this kind of knowledge, because you're going to be bumping up against trauma if you're doing this work. It's just that important, and unfortunately cannot be covered well enough in your initial tapping training workshops and certifications. If you are a tapping professional, you've got to have the knowledge of knowing when and when not to work with a client, when a referral is needed, how to establish those referrals. The field of somatic trauma release is growing by leaps and bounds all the time with new information. You've heard, hopefully, some of the great thinkers that are out there, like Stephen Porges, polyvagal theory by Bessel van der Kolk, Pat Ogden, Stephen Levine, Dan Siegel, so much more. And when we bring in many of these concepts, you'll be able to have the benefit of us going out and learning them and working them over and over and making them simple to understand. And that is really important. The good news is that EFT and tapping are neuroregulating techniques already. And that's one of the greatest gifts we have, and it really should and needs to be used wisely. And that's really what this course is all about. It's about using your tapping just effectively, but also wisely and responsibly. So if this has you realizing, wow, I really don't have as much training in working with trauma as I thought maybe I did, and maybe I'm realizing, you know what, it's possible that I really could do harm when I thought I couldn't, then this kind of course is for you. In the Tapping Out of Trauma webinar, you're going to learn how to effectively integrate somatic trauma release techniques and immediately put them into your practice. You'll learn how important neuroregulation is, both your own and your clients, and how to achieve that. You'll learn the mechanism of how trauma wires the brain, and you'll learn how tapping and other somatic trauma techniques rewire the brain and nervous system and body to release the trauma. As a result of the webinar, which is 8 weeks, 8 classes, you'll be able to communicate more effectively with more insight about trauma, which will help you educate your clients, which will help them take a lot of the shame and stigma of the trauma they've experienced away. And that's huge. And lastly, you'll be able to better collaborate with a lot of other practitioners outside the tapping arena, because you'll be able to explain why tapping is an effective somatic trauma release tool. So, how do you find out more? What more is in the class? Well, it begins on February 6th. And with the class, you're going to get a lot of information, a lot of ways to learn. You'll be getting graphics, handouts, videos, case studies. We're going to be covering everything from beginning with the foundation of understanding the physiology of stress and trauma, working into neuroregulation and the application of those neuroregulatory techniques, working with interpersonal neurobiology of stress and trauma. You're going to move then into learning client and practitioner resourcing and what that means and how critical that is, and the use of somatic techniques for regulation. You're going to learn the basics of the scope of trauma, the behaviors, emotions, cognitions, and physical symptoms of trauma. You're going to be able to incorporate somatic oscillation techniques for processing trauma. You're going to be able to better understand the signs and symptoms of complex trauma and PTSD, so you know, depending on what your licensure is, whether that's something you can work with or whether you need to refer out, or whether you're able to work in collaboration with other providers for those people. You'll learn more about vicarious trauma. So there's just a lot of things that we're going to be covering in those 8 weeks. The price of the course is $299. It includes the 8-week class, which are 75-minute classes. There is an online facilitated private community forum, which you'll be able to ask questions 24/7. You have a handout manual. You've got the PowerPoint PDFs. You've got the downloadable class recordings. And you'll have a certificate of completion. And the exciting part is that for U.S. participants, we have pending CE credits through the National Association of Social Workers, NASW, that we should be hearing any day now. So, in summary, what do I want to say? Trauma is something that if you're a tapping practitioner, you have to have a greater training with and a depth and breadth of training so you know how to be able to work with them, what to work with, not what to work with, to be able to keep you safe, to be able to keep your client safe, and to most effectively understand the things that you didn't know you didn't know. So, I'm going to finish up and see if Suzanne has any last comments. I want to thank you for being on the call tonight, whether you were live or you're listening to the recording. The registration page is at www.tappingoutoftrauma.com. If you have, on the site, there's a way to contact us. On the bottom, there's a Contact Us link if you have any questions. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you beginning February 6th, and we hope that you've got something important that you can implement right away or that you know that you need to learn more about. So I just want to say thank you for being with us on this call. Suzanne?
Thank you, Craig, and I'll just add my thank yous as well and say that, you know, in spite of the fact that this could be a very heavy topic, we have fun on the calls as well, in the class and on the forum. So come and join us and learn something that will be invaluable to you, not only in your EFT tapping practice, but in your life as well. So we hope to see you in the class.